our online Bible study. Happy Monday. I hope you're having a great start to your week. I hope you were able to join us in church yesterday because we had a blast. We did worship through the ages and we just totally mixed it up and we had a great time praising Jesus. So I hope that you were there with us, and if not, I hope you'll be able to go back and catch it online. You can always catch it on Facebook or YouTube if you had to miss it for some reason. So if you were not here, we missed you, and I hope that we will get to see you this coming Sunday. I'll be bringing a message for a couple of weeks here, a new sermon series called Shaken. What happens when God shakes the heavens and the earth. So I'm really excited about that sermon series and sharing it with you. And I'm excited about us being most of the way through our Bible study for this summer. It's exciting that we've been able to join each other together like this. I hope that you are enjoying learning about the prophecies of Jesus and how the different prophets lived their lives and some other cool things that we've explored together. It's been a lot of fun. So today, we are in our next section of the blue pamphlet, okay? So we have graduated to section of Jesus' death and resurrection. And today I want to just take a few moments to talk about what a prophecy actually is. We talked about prophets, and we talked about the fact that they are those who are called by God to speak on God's behalf to the people because he gives them a message, and the prophets then share that with the people. Sometimes the message is welcomed, sometimes it's not. In fact, a lot of what we see in the Old Testament was not a very welcome message to the people of Israel because God was trying to warn them about how their unfaithfulness would get them into trouble. But I wanted you to understand a little bit more about prophecy because it's really not something that we talk about very often in church or really in today's society. So I wanted you to understand that there are a couple different types of prophecies. First of all, we have the prophecies that we're probably kind of familiar with in the Old Testament, those that are known as a warning, something that God says to the people where he warns them of how their unfaithful behavior has consequences and what he will do if they do not remain faithful. And frankly, a lot of people can look at the Old Testament, the prophets, the major, the minor prophets, and those books. They can look at that a lot of times as God being very harsh. I look at it very differently, actually. Yes, there are some things in there that are pretty harsh, but I look at it as a loving parent letting you know, here's what's going to happen if you don't change your ways. I mean, I've got two girls entering into their teenage years, so you can pray for me. But they also, I love them so much that there are times when I have to say to them, hey, listen, here's what's going to happen. Here's the consequence. I'm trying to warn you ahead of time so that you don't have to experience this terrible consequence. That to me is love. And so I tend to view the Old Testament as, even though we see some things that are harsh about God, that it actually shows his loving nature towards us, because an unloving God would not tell people what he was going to do. He wouldn't warn them of danger. He wouldn't warn them of the consequences of their sin. An unloving God wouldn't care. But God, because he cares about us, wants us to know that there is consequence for sin. And so he's very upfront with us about that. So we've got the prophecies that are warnings. That's one kind of prophecy. Then we've got the prophecy that can sometimes be a mixture of a warning, but also a foretelling of the future, like having a foreknowledge of something that is going to happen. And a lot of times the major and minor prophets mix both of these types of prophecies because we see the warning in the prophecy, but then we also see that God is saying, here's what the future will hold, so here is what I want you to do. So there's those kind. But then in the New Testament, we see in 1 Corinthians, where Paul is writing his letter to the Corinthians, we see him talk about spiritual gifts and the gift of prophecy. And so if you're interested in that, I would encourage you to read chapter 14 of 1 Corinthians. I'm just going to read a little verse out of it for you so you can kind of understand a little bit more about another type of prophecy that it says in verse 3, but everyone who prophesies speaks to men for their strengthening, encouragement, and comfort. He who speaks in a tongue edifies himself, but he who prophesies edifies the church. And so he's talking about the gift of speaking in tongues, the gift of prophecy, and we see very much so that prophecy is also meant to encourage and to comfort and to edify the church. So there's also that kind of prophecy. So when we see the prophets telling us the good news that is to come, it's to build us up, it's to lift us up, and to help us move into the future with confidence and hope. And so prophecies aren't always about bad things that are going to happen. A lot of times they're about great things that are going to happen. And we're going to see that a little bit here later on as we talk about our prophecies for today. So I'm excited. We're going to focus on one particular prophet today. Now, if you look in your section on Jesus' death and resurrection, you're going to see that there are a lot of prophecies. But today I want to focus on just one prophet, and that is Zechariah. Last week, we focused a little bit on Amos. I told you a little bit about his history, who he was, how he came to be a prophet. And today I want to focus on a couple of the prophecies from Zechariah. Zechariah was actually kind of a young prophet. He kind of partnered with the prophet Haggai, who was a little bit older. And these two prophets were both prophets to the kingdom of Judah. Now, if you've been with us in this study, you know that Judah is from the southern kingdom. Israel is the northern kingdom when they both split. Israel was taken over by Assyria, and Judah ended up being taken over by Babylon. So that's where we come to when Zechariah is the prophet. What has happened is these Jews in Judah have been overtaken by the Babylonian Empire. And so they are in Babylonia and they are slaves there. But then the king of Persia takes over Babylonia in the 500 AD-ish range, and he decides to let this remnant of the Jews return back to their home so that they can rebuild the temple. And this is a really big deal because this is kind of like a turning point in our history as Christians, because what happens here is this remnant goes back home and they find everything destroyed and they decide to rebuild, which of course, as you can imagine, is somewhat devastating. We know about devastation in Oklahoma. We know what it's like when things are destroyed and we have to rebuild together as a community. And you can imagine that this group of people who's been exiled and they have been taken away from their home and they have been in captivity for about 70 years, then they're told, you can go back home. So they go and they're going to rebuild. But it's very discouraging to start out. It's very hard to see everything that you have loved completely destroyed. It's hard to see their place of worship no longer there anymore. It's just in ruins. And so they are going to rebuild this, and that is very exciting in our history because it is out of that remnant that we find a girl named Mary and a man named Joseph and an angel who appears to Mary to say, you are highly favored, and you will bear a son, and you are to call him Jesus. So it's out of this small remnant that we see this happen. So that's actually pretty cool. So Zechariah is prophesying to the Jews from Judah who have come out of captivity. They're going back home, and he's going to be talking to them about rebuilding the temple. So as we look at those prophecies, you're going to find these specific ones that we're looking at on pages 7, 8, and 9 of your pamphlet. Now, I told you last week they're really small page numbers at the bottom of each page, and this is actually on the back side of your pamphlet. We graduated to the back side. Congratulations. So we are going to look at those today. The first one we're going to look at, first and second one, are on page 8 and 9. It's at the very bottom of page 8 and the very top of page 9, okay? You'll see Zechariah there, chapter 11 is where these two prophecies come from. Now, I wanted to specifically pick some prophecies that we might not be as familiar with. I think those of us who've been around Christianity for a long time kind of know some of the typical ones, like from Isaiah, where he says, for unto us a child is born, and his name shall be called Wonderful Counselor, Mighty God, Prince of Peace, the Everlasting Father, because we sing about that at Christmas time. So we know about those kind of prophecies. But these prophecies from Zechariah, I don't think we're all as familiar with. I found them very interesting as I was doing some research in them. So I want you to flip to your Bible, if you have your Bible with you, and we're going to look at Zechariah chapter 11. Now, Zechariah is the 11th of the 12 minor prophets. So he's towards the very end of the Old Testament, and that's where we find him. So as we look at this, we're looking in chapter 11, and a lot of times with the major and minor prophets, they're hard books to get through because they don't make a whole lot of sense. And so that's okay. Don't feel bad about that. Everybody feels that way. But it's really cool when we find these snippets of things that really click with us and the puzzle pieces start to come together. And the cool thing about Zechariah is that in his book, he has the largest number of messianic prophecies of any of the minor prophets, which I think is really cool. And so there's all these things that connect to Jesus as the Messiah in the book of Zechariah. And this is one of them. So as we look at chapter 11, we go to verse 12, I think is where I'd like for you to go. And if you read the entire chapter, again, you may find yourself a little bit confused, but that's all right. But Zechariah goes on to say God is saying these things. So Zechariah, again, as a prophet, is speaking on behalf of God to the people. And so starting in verse 12, he says, I told them, if you think it best, give me my pay, but if not, keep it. So they paid me 30 pieces of silver. And then the Lord said to me, throw it to the potter, the handsome price at which they priced me. So I took the 30 pieces of silver and threw them into the house of the Lord to the potter. Now, you may be like, what is she talking about with pieces of silver and who is the potter? It's okay. So what we do here is what we see about this, and if you know the story, the passion part of Christ's story, you know that 30 pieces of silver plays a really big part in his crucifixion. And so I want you to flip over to Matthew, where we see Jesus' story, and we're going to flip to actually chapter 27. You can see the prophecies fulfilled in 27 and also in, Matthew 26. So you've got both of those listed on your pamphlet. But I want you to flip over to Matthew 27 because this is really interesting in light of what we just read in the book of Zechariah. So Judas has handed Jesus over to the Roman authorities. He's handed him over to Pilate, and so they're getting ready to crucify Jesus. And Judas realizes that he really messed up. And so I'm going to start here in verse 3 of chapter 27 of Matthew. When Judas, who had betrayed him, saw that Jesus was condemned, he was seized with remorse and returned the 30 pieces of silver that he had given to the chief priests and the elders. I have sinned, he said, for I have betrayed innocent blood. What is it to us? They replied. That's your responsibility. So Judas threw the money into the temple, the house of the Lord, and left. Then he went away and hanged himself. Now listen to this next part. The chief priest picked up the coins and said, it is against the law to put this into the treasury since it is blood money. So they decided to use the money to buy the potter's field as a burial place for foreigners. That is why it has been called the field of blood to this day. Friends, it's really interesting to me that in Zechariah we see God saying these things about the price that you have put on me and the 30 pieces of silver, and that he said, throw it into the house of the Lord to the potter. How incredible is that we see this connection? You know, this prophecy from Zechariah was more than 500 years before Jesus was born. And we've got details down to 30 pieces of silver and to the potter. I mean, that is truly remarkable. So interesting as we see this with Zechariah. Then I want you to also flip to page 7 in your pamphlet. At the top, we've got a prophecy both from Psalms and from Zechariah together. And this prophecy is that Jesus' hands and feet will be pierced. So we see in Zechariah chapter 12, so we just were in chapter 11, and sorry, I just about knocked you off of my desk. That would have been tragic. I'm so glad I didn't do that. Okay, so we were just in chapter 11, and now we're flipping over into chapter 12 of Zechariah. And I want you to skip down to verse 10 in chapter 12 of Zechariah, and we see, again, God talking through the prophet, and he says, and I will pour out on the house of David and the inhabitants of Jerusalem a spirit of grace and supplication. They will look on me, the one they have pierced, and they will mourn for him as one mourns for an only child, and grieve bitterly for him as one grieves for a firstborn. So, friends, interesting here as we see this, we know that, again, Zechariah has the most messianic prophecies of any of the minor prophets. And then we see here that Jesus will be pierced, and God is referring to himself in this passage, that they looked upon the one they pierced, that he is that one. So we see the fulfillment of that in John, the Gospel of John, where it says, Unless I see the nail marks in his hands and put my hand into his side, I will not believe it. This was Thomas saying this. Then he said, reach out your hand and put it into my side. That's what Jesus said. But we know that they pierced Jesus' side, and that out of his side flowed blood and water. And they pierced him to make sure that he was dead on the cross. So, friends, it's so interesting to me as we look at the prophet Zechariah. Again, this was a young prophet. This was someone that God had called to this gifting that was not extremely experienced. And yet God chose to use him in such a way as to point everyone towards the Messiah. I find that fascinating. I find the details of the prophecies totally awesome. And so, friends, again, I hope that you will remember as we look at these types of prophecies, and again, this is the type where we're seeing a foretelling of something that's going to happen in the future, that it shows us God's nature. It shows us his incredible love for us, that he is willing to not only warn us, but also to show us his plan, to allow us to be a part of that incredible plan, and to be able to enjoy those blessings. One of the things that's interesting also about Zechariah is that he not only prophesied about Jesus' death and resurrection, he also prophesies about the second coming of Jesus. So something that hasn't even taken place yet. And his prophecy happened 500 years before Jesus was even born on the earth. And so he prophesies about that. He prophesies about the Jews being scattered across the earth and about the persecution that they will face. We've seen that in the 1900s. We saw such incredible persecution of the Jews. And so Zechariah was not only prophesying about things that we see fulfilled in the New Testament, he was prophesying about things that we have yet to see fulfilled. And that truly is incredible, that God wanted to place in someone's heart this message of what will happen for you and for me even today, because God's message is relevant. It doesn't matter the time, it doesn't matter the place. His message is always relevant. So friends, that's what I have for you today. I hope you enjoyed learning about Zechariah. We're going to continue in this section for our video on Wednesday. So keep reading and looking and doing some research of your own on these prophecies as we continue in the prophecies about Jesus' death and resurrection. And then we will continue next week with our last section on the attributes of Jesus, and that'll be our last week for the summer. Now, friends, I'm excited that we're moving into fall, and I've got groups together planning what our midweek classes will be. If you're not familiar with what midweek is, those are our fall and spring classes that we have on Wednesday night, and we also have a dinner at church every Wednesday night, and I love getting to see people at dinner at church on Wednesday night, and I love getting to have some good cooking, because y'all know I don't experience that at my own house unless my husband is cooking, and so I love that too, that at least once a week I get some good home cooked meals. So I hope that you'll make plans to join us this fall for midweek as well, and that you'll be on the lookout for what our classes are, because we've got some great ones that we're going to be offering. And I'm glad that you've joined us again for this great Monday of our online Bible study, and I hope that you will have a wonderful week. I'll be praying for you, and I look forward to seeing you Wednesday.